In the near future, mysterious creatures appear from thin air and begin slaughtering humanity, causing an apocalyptic disaster with few survivors left. There are many theories about this event, such as an insect carrying a disease, a purple mist, or a punishment for humankind. But all of this is just speculation. No one knows exactly what happened. In a town, Paul is searching for supplies when suddenly alarm sirens blare. He immediately runs outside, crossing the streets, hiding when necessary, and avoiding the screams and explosions. As the city is engulfed in thick black smoke, Paul reaches an abandoned house on the outskirts and reunites with his children, the kids he must care for alone. 15 years later, Paul's two sons have grown into strong teenagers. They live in that house, going out during the day to search for supplies, but always hiding at night. As soon as the sun began to set, Joseph covered the windows and called his father into the house. Paul waits outside until he sees Thomas return and scolds him for being late. Thomas explains that he enjoys helping the Rose family, their neighbors with the farm. Then all three make sure that every door and window is securely locked before having dinner. Paul scolds Thomas again, saying that if he is late again, he won't be allowed outside anymore. Joseph teases his older brother about it, and the argument quickly turns into a fight. However, Paul quickly intervenes and reminds them that they are men, not animals. After dinner, Paul watches his sons play chess, but is distracted when Rocco starts scratching and growling at the floor. Seeing this as an omen, Paul and Thomas head downstairs and are startled when they hear a sudden banging on the door. It seems the creatures are trying to break in, so they immediately brace the door to prevent them from forcing it open. The shaking and banging continue for a few seconds until the creatures give up and leave. Thomas immediately criticizes Joseph for not helping, but Joseph reveals that he was listening to learn more. There were 3 attempts. The first was 10 seconds, the second was 20 seconds, and the last was a strong knock. Joseph thought the first was just a test, the second was the real attempt to break in, and the third was an angry knock. The next morning, they checked the door and found claw marks on the wood. The door had weakened significantly, so Paul and his sons went outside to find wood to reinforce it. They brought back everything they could find, and while Thomas chopped the wood, Paul checked on Joseph, who was making something in the shed. After some encouragement from Paul, Joseph admitted that he had tried to build a vehicle because he was tired of feeling trapped and scared. However, he couldn't get it to work. Paul was impressed and examined the vehicle, quickly making a few adjustments to get it running. Excited, Paul took his sons for a ride to teach them how to drive. Then they went home. Paul announced that the windows still needed to be reinforced, and his 2 children needed to go to the river to collect more materials. Thomas was angry because he was promised they would go to the farm today, but Paul said the work was more important. The 2 brothers left in the vehicle, and Thomas began to blame Joseph, saying that Paul only sent Thomas to protect Joseph. Joseph didn't think he needed protection, so Thomas got out of the vehicle when they passed the farm and asked Joseph to come back for him. Meanwhile, at home, Paul finished reinforcing the door and took a break, sitting alone by the waterfall to smoke. As he looked around, he saw a dark, ominous hole in the rock. At the same time, Joseph went to the river, tied himself to the vehicle, and boarded an old, abandoned boat to search for supplies. Inside a cupboard, he found a photo of a dirty porn magazine, which stunned him for a moment. He then continued searching and was suddenly startled when a swarm of insects flew out from a pile of garbage. They flew around him and tried to approach his skin, forcing him to hurriedly leave the area. At the farm, Thomas helped the family with work, but the main reason he was there was the farm owner's daughter, Charlotte. Clearly, the 2 teenagers had feelings for each other, and they walked together in the fields. Charlotte showed Thomas a rope tied to a tree, explaining that when she was little, she was only allowed to play outside if she stayed connected to the tree. So she often tied herself to the tree to run around more freely while keeping the connection with the tree. The 2 also played a game, sharing wild theories about the cause of the apocalypse. When it was time for Thomas to leave, Charlotte gave him a tight hug. The sun began to set and Thomas hurried back home. Paul returned home and grew worried when he saw Rocco, but didn't see his 2 sons coming back. Joseph started the vehicle, but it wouldn't start at first. After a few attempts, the vehicle finally ran. Thomas ran at full speed, but suddenly slipped and fell into a crack in the ground. When Joseph arrived to pick him up, Thomas was nowhere to be found, so he just continued on. After returning home and telling his father what had happened, Paul told Joseph to go inside and lock the door while he and Rocco went to look for Thomas. At the crack, Thomas woke up with using a lighter. He began searching around and suddenly saw a creature reaching its hand through a hole in the wall. The creature let out a scream that Paul and Rocco heard. Carefully, Thomas drew his knife and stabbed the creature's hand, making it pull its hand back into the hole. However, as Thomas stepped back, a second creature appeared from above and grabbed his face. Paul arrived in time, pulled the creature off, and quickly killed it. After ensuring Thomas was okay, Paul and Rocco found a cellar leading straight to the crack. Since moving through the forest at this hour was very dangerous, they decided to stay in the crack until sunrise to protect themselves, while also blocking the exit. They heard the creatures approaching through the hole, so they prepared the flares. However, the ground suddenly began to shake. It turned out the monsters were moving underground and surrounded their group by filling the exit with dirt. When the crack kept moving, Paul told his son and the dog to stay back. He threw a flare into the opening in the dirt. When the creatures tried to reach out, Paul created a small explosion. Meanwhile, back home, Joseph heard the wood creaking and began to make a plan. A few minutes later, he sat by the front door, tying a rope to his chair and falling asleep. Not long after, a creature moved the wood, blocking the hole in the door, and reached its hand inside, extending its long claws to test if Joseph was truly asleep. When the boy did not react, the creature rushed inside, but Joseph immediately woke up and pulled the rope. The cage fell from the ceiling, instantly trapping the creature, which made Joseph feel proud of himself. The next morning, he grew worried because his father and brother hadn't returned, so he decided to drive out to search for them. Meanwhile, Thomas had dug through the collapsed dirt to reopen the entrance and pulled his heavily injured father out. Rocco also went outside, following the sound of the car to find Joseph and lead him back to the family. The two brothers immediately carried Paul to the car, then brought him home and placed him in bed, discussing how to proceed. Thomas finally noticed the cage and lifted the blanket, driving the monster into a frenzy. Joseph quickly covered the blanket again, explaining that the light hurt the monster. They bandage Paul's wounds, while Joseph explains that last night the monster took 8 seconds to enter the house, the fastest yet. He is also sure that another creature left, and notices their behavior is changing. Thomas believes the monsters are smart. Last night they killed many in the cave, and maybe they came here for revenge, because Charlotte said they rarely appear at the farm. Joseph doesn't think they killed the monsters, but believes only Paul did it to prove himself. Thomas tries to kill the creature in the cage, but Joseph stops him because he wants to study it. During the struggle, the monster quickly escaped and hid under the bed. When it poked its head out, Rocco started barking, causing the monster to transform and charge to attack. Joseph rushed to hold it down, and Thomas chopped off its head with an axe. Wanting to learn more, Joseph took the monster's body to the barn and began dissecting it while Rocco and a swarm of bugs watched. No matter how much he cut, he couldn't gain any further understanding of it. At this point, Thomas suggested they take Paul to Charlotte's farm because they had a better house and actual medicine. Joseph didn't think the Rose family would help, but Thomas insisted on going with him. The two brothers placed Paul in the car and drove to the farm. There, Charlotte's parents proved Joseph right. They didn't have enough medicine to treat someone so badly injured, so they refused to take him in. Charlotte disagreed, but was ignored. However, her parents agreed to let Thomas stay, which would provide Paul and Joseph with more resources. Joseph immediately left, and when Thomas chased after him, an argument broke out, during which Joseph blamed Thomas for their father's impending death. Thomas, in anger, shoved his younger brother to the ground and strangled him. But when he realized what he was doing, Joseph immediately got in the car and drove off with their unconscious father. Afterward, Thomas joined the family at the farm. Charlotte then shared a delicious meal with Thomas and showed him some items he had never seen before. The two teenagers shared a sweet moment and kissed, but they were interrupted when Charlotte's father entered and asked her to go to another room. On the way back, Joseph noticed the sheep running in panic and piles of dirt scattered everywhere, which meant the creatures were moving underground. After taking care of his father, Joseph went into the barn and began collecting items to plan his next move. He also started covering all the windows. He suddenly fell when he stepped on a rug. There's a hole under the carpet. Monsters have entered the house. At the farm, Charlotte found Thomas sneaking around in the kitchen. He was still worried about his father and wanted to find some medicine to leave. Charlotte handed him the medicine, and Thomas thanked her with a hug, promising to return, unaware that someone was eavesdropping. Thomas hurried outside, but before he could reach the gate, a farm worker aimed a gun at him and accused him of stealing. Thomas desperately tried to explain that Charlotte had given him the medicine, but the man didn't believe him. All the farm workers joined forces and took Thomas to the barn, where they tied him up and played loud music to cover what they were about to do to him. They grabbed Thomas's legs, and one man was about to shoot, but just then, a hole appeared beneath his feet, causing him to fall and making the shot miss. The other men rushed to check on him, just as a creature jumped out of the hole. At the main house, Charlotte's parents woke up when they heard the noise. The father lit a candle to check, and a monster burst into the room and attacked. The candle fell, immediately starting a fire, while the creature jumped from the father to the mother, trying to kill both of them. The father pulled it back, and the mother ran out of the room to find her daughter, but the creature leapt onto her before she could get too far. The creature trembled and transformed again, beginning to vomit on the woman before attacking. In the bedroom, Charlotte heard her parents being killed. When the sound stopped, Charlotte went outside and was horrified to discover a trail of blood that she followed until she found the creature in the bathroom, carrying her mother's body on its back. At the barn, the men were trying to fight off the creatures, but to no avail. One by one, they were killed, and the remaining men fled. More and more creatures arrived, and the barn began to catch fire. Thomas struggled to overturn furniture and break wooden slats to free his hands. At that moment, a creature noticed him, but before it could attack, it was shot down by Charlotte. The two ran outside, and Thomas, seeing the house on fire, tried to run back to save it. Charlotte explained that her parents were dead, so they decided to go to Thomas's house. Back with Joseph, he threw a pile of things into the hole to buy time, then checked on his unconscious father. He kissed his forehead and prepared himself to fight. The hole in the door suddenly opened, but it was only Thomas and Charlotte who appeared. Joseph admitted that he needed Thomas's help, but their conversation was interrupted when Paul woke up. He quickly took the medicine and told his children to continue fighting. Joseph shared his plan with everyone, and they gathered all the gasoline cans from the barn. Meanwhile, Rocco kept barking to alert them of the approaching danger. The group began moving an old freezer into the house. Then Thomas and Charlotte started reinforcing all the remaining windows, while Joseph piled up items and poured gasoline over them. He also added all the explosives he could find, including his father's cigarette, which was slowly burning. Suddenly, the pile of items began to shake. At the same time, a creature crawled down the chimney into the room where Paul was. As another creature emerged from the hole, it charged toward a door, and Thomas stabbed it from behind. The creature immediately retaliated, but Thomas quickly pulled out a knife and drove it into the creature's head, killing it. The monster charged at Charlotte, and she quickly shot it down. The two of them then rushed to Joseph's side and began moving the freezer again. The door opened behind them, and Paul was standing there, covered in blood from killing the monster in the chimney. Paul grabbed Charlotte's gun and began firing down at the floor to eliminate the creatures below. The swarm of monsters was overwhelming, appearing in the hallway and charging toward Paul. Paul kicked the first creature, causing the floor to shake, and its weight caused most of the monsters to fall to the lower floor. A few managed to maintain their balance, but the three children quickly ran over to eliminate them before they could attack Paul. Paul was impressed with the group's excellent coordination. Then, the three children and Rocco ran to the freezer. Instead of following, Paul closed the door and stayed behind to buy them more time. The group hid in the freezer, while Paul remembered the day he tightly hugged his young children, whispering to them that everything would be okay. A new horde of monsters charged in, and Paul distracted them until the pile of objects finally exploded, causing the entire house to collapse and catch fire. The freezer started to roll and continued rolling for several minutes. When it stopped, the three children stepped out and hurried to search for Paul in the rubble, but suddenly, a monster jumped out. The group ran to the car and drove off, while the monster chased them. Charlotte shot at the monster, but the bullet had no effect. As the monster got closer, she hit it with a gun, causing it to fall. A few miles later, the group stopped by the road and looked up at the starry sky, something they had never seen before since they were always inside at night. The next morning, the group returned to the old house and decided not to rebuild there. After collecting what they could, they buried all their loved ones and said their final goodbyes. Then the three children and Rocco drove off, hoping to find a new home at the farms down the valley. You just watched a summary of the movie Arcadian. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to watch more videos like this. Thank you for watching.